We are reading Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, and currently the chapter deals with the phrase. The chapter deals with the phrase "sense of our sense," which the Kena Upanishad has described as that which sees not with the eye, that by which one sees the eyes seeing. Know that to be the Brahman. That which hears not with the ear, that by which the ear's hearing is heard. Know that to be the Brahman. The way the Sanskrit phrase is worded, the same text could be also understood as that which one sees not with the eye, that which one hears not with the ear. So there's a double meaning implied. The Brahman cannot be known by our physical senses, and yet it is the Brahman which is the sense of our physical senses. The true sense is taking place in the Brahman consciousness, and the physical senses are only its representations or its organization, rendering in terms of a consciousness living in a physical body. In the portion we have read so far, Sri Aurobindo first begins with our current concept of what the senses are, and our current concept is these are functions of organs. Yes, the mind sees through the senses, but finally the senses are functions of our physical organs and the life force working in the physical organs. And so, to attribute to the senses something greater which belongs to a supramental consciousness does not seem very sensible, does not make meaning to our current understanding. But then Sri Aurobindo says, we have to look deeper behind the outward appearances, we must penetrate. And he asks the key question here. What in essence is the thing we call sense? In essence as different from in functioning. What we observe as senses are what we observe in functioning. So we say light enters, passes through the lens, makes an image on the retina, it gets processed in the brain, etc. This is all part of the functioning of the sense. But what is the essence of the sense experience? And he says, that in the functioning we can see these steps, but in essence there is something else that's happening. So first he describes the functioning. All functioning of sense involves mind making contact with an eidolon of matter. And we saw this through the examples of the five senses. The tree in front of me is never seen by the mind directly. Its representation in my physical consciousness, inside my retina, is what my mind enters in contact with. If there is something in between, a screen, blocking the light from the tree, I cannot see the tree. If in between there is a variation of air density from heat, when the ground is very hot, there is the heat waves which rise and which make the air shake, which make the air move in density. Then the light coming from the tree is broken, is moving, and it seems to me as if the whole picture is shimmering. Because what I see is not tree, but its representation inside my eyes. And that's the eidolon of the material object. But mind does not enter in relation with the eidolon also directly. From the eidolon, there is a whole movement of nervous energy which links it to the mind. So mind leans on nervous energy which touches the eidolon, and there is therefore, he says, Sri Aurobindo says, 3 steps. The first step is when there is a transfer of from the material object to the eidolon of the material object, the material eidolon he calls. Secondly, the nervous or energy image, because the life energy takes from this eidolon a kind of what Sri Aurobindo describes as nervous impression of form through contactual image, to which the life force gives its interpretation, its values, its imaging. And then on top of that, the mind takes the third step. The image is reproduced in the stuff of the mind, and the mind gives to it its values. So if we look, for example, at the tree itself, there is an image cast in the physical eye and represented in the material consciousness in an image or in its conversion to electrical signals. The life energy now receives these signals of energy, of electricity, which are its most material representation in matter. Life energy takes this and creates an imprint of tree. In its first example, if we look at tree, in its first imprint, the life energy feels peaceful, secure, safe. But then it sees also, or it senses a movement in the tree, and from the movement, it perhaps draws an association and feels danger. None of this has so far touched the mind consciousness proper. The mind takes these impressions, draws its own associations. Oh, this tree I have never seen before. What are the fruits? It starts thinking, it gives it its own value. Is it useful? Or it sees that movement and it says, is it the wind that is blowing? Is it a snake which is moving? Is there a creature hidden inside the leaves? Is it a bird? Is it safe? So in the vital consciousness, there can already be some kind of interpretation and translation, which then influences the mind very clearly. I hear a sound, for example, when people write on the blackboard with chalk, sometimes the chalk makes a scraping sound. Many people are sensitive to that and they feel the whole body shivering. They can't bear that sound. It hurts them physically. That's the registration taking place in the life energy of the body. The mind itself says, oh, it's only chalk. I have nothing to fear. But this discomfort, somehow you cannot overcome, you cannot override, and it's happening in the life energy. In the same way, in the first appearance of an animal, the life energy may have an instinctive response of fear or safety. You may have never seen the animal, and yet it has some registration. I have mentioned once some strange research which I had read about. They were observing sheep crossing the highway, and they were measuring the heart rate of the sheep. They noticed that whenever the sheep approaches the highway and has to cross it, the heart rate goes up. There is fear, there is some sense of danger. Although the sheep may have never seen a highway, it may have never seen a car, it may have never been hit by a car. In the collective consciousness or in the life energy itself, there is a recognition that this is a dangerous area. This is a dangerous passage. And suddenly there is a perking up of the life energy in apprehension or even in fear. And it's on this level that animals sense things like earthquakes or tsunami or even storms. And they take preemptive, protective, instinctive steps, even leaving the place where the earthquake will take or where the tsunami is going to hit. And therefore you see in nature, rarely ever are animals hurt by natural disasters. But if you ask the animal, why are you leaving? They do not know. They just feel this fear, and the fear pushes them in the direction of what is safer. There is not yet registration of mind. In the case of the human being, because the mental values are primary for us, even if we sense things on the life force level, we do not consider it a conscious awareness. We don't know yet that we are sensing some discomfort. In certain experiments, we are able to show that something in the brain actually anticipates or senses when there is danger or there's a shock of the sense to come. For example, when images are flashed rapidly on the screen and we are asked to respond to the image, it is found that even before a shocking image appears, there is a reaction in the brain of something which prepares for the shock. So something in our consciousness is sensing even before the physical image comes. This is obviously not the biology, not the material eidolon, not yet the conscious mind, but something in the life energy itself which is able to sense or anticipate in advance things which belong to the inner mind or the inner vital. And there's already a bracing, a kind of a reaction which is measured in the nervous system and in the brain itself. So this level of the vital energy's response is extremely important, although almost unconscious to us. And only after that does the mind reproduce in stuff of mind the image of what is seen. That image is very different from the physical image. When you see tree, the mind's seeing of tree is the familiar idea of tree and not this particular image of tree. So I stand before the forest and I have idea of forest. My mind then zooms in and notices a tree and I have idea of tree. It's only when somebody tells me, don't you see? Look carefully. At that point, my mind enters into a kind of an analysis. What is unusual about this tree? Oh, it's not actually a real tree. It's a plastic tree because the shine is somewhat different. Or I notice that this particular tree has something very unusual which I have not seen before. So it needs for the mind to break through its normal looking at ideas to turn to the physical sensation and draw specifics and to zoom in on what the body sense is seeing properly. Once I've seen that a few times, I already begin to operate at the level of my ideas. Oh yes, this is now a new species of tree, a new species of animal. I'm familiar with it. So if you observe in this way, most of our mental consciousness rarely enjoys the physical world as it actually is. It mostly lives in idea of things and the values we give to those ideas. And this is the reason why you will find people live in a kind of a half-sleep state in a world of their own creation. And it needs often a physical shock to wake up and to realize, oh, something is not okay. The mind quickly adjusts to the new arrangement and then again begins to live in the idea of the new arrangement. So these are the three levels through which there is a very rapid translation. And Sri Aurobindo explains that this elaborate process is concealed from us by the lightning-like rapidity with which it is managed. Rapidity in our impressions of time. For in another notation of time, by a creature differently constituted, each part of the operation might be distinctly sensible. And we discussed this last time briefly. It is possible for us also to enter in a different kind of state of time experience, where these three things are distinctly perceived. In the yoga tradition, there is a particular line of experience in which one can even experience the whole universe as dissolving and being recreated at each moment again and again and again. And one can then concentrate on the gap between each appearance, each dissolution and appearance of the universe. And one enters a kind of a sense of the blankness behind, out of which or against which the universe is at each moment recreated. When one enters that kind of a consciousness, then even the processes within us become very differently seen, differently perceived. There's the famous story in the Buddhist tradition, for example. Similar stories also in the yogic tradition. In the Buddhist tradition particularly, because mind is given a central position in the whole experience of the universe and of consciousness, there's a conversation where two monks are discussing. The first says, "It is the flag which is waving." The second monk says, "No, it is the wind which is waving and the flag follows." And they are arguing. And a third monk comes. He hears them discuss and he says, "You're both wrong. It is the mind which is waving. Neither the wind moves nor the flag moves. It is the mind which moves." And the head of the monastery hears this third monk and says, "Ah, here's an enlightened man." Meaning, the monk lives in a state of consciousness in which he realizes that all that we experience of the world is finally experienced in the mental consciousness. And if the mind chooses to still itself, then the whole world and its movements and its realities will simply fade away. And so it is a state of awakening into a certain poise of mental consciousness. Of course, it does not, the reality of the world does not vanish, but still it is an experience of the mind. So Sri Aurobindo explains, but the triple translation is always there, because there are really three sheets of consciousness in us. The material, Anna Kosha, in which the physical contact and image are received and formed. The vital and nervous, Prana Kosha, in which there is a nervous contact and formation. The mental, Manaha Kosha, in which there is a mental contact and imaging. So the physical contact is when the light reaches your retina. The vital and nervous contact and imaging is from the retina when there is a transfer into electrical character. And in the life energy within us, the impression comes. And the mental contact and imaging is from the life force taking place not in the brain but after the brain, from brain when it enters the mental consciousness in the mental body. So the part where there is the nerves and the brain are in process is the most physical part of the prana kosha, the vital layer, vital envelope. The mind comes in after that. And so it's as if there are three levels at which an imaging and formation is taking place. We dwell centered in the mental sheath, and therefore the experience of the material world has to come through the other two sheaths before it can reach us. Now this is something extremely important. We actually never experience the material world as it is. All material realities have to pass through material eidolon, a translation through a life energy imaging, and then comes to the mind. And if it does not pass through these two layers, we do not experience the world. In situations of war, when a person is sitting, there is an explosion of a bomb. Suddenly, by the blast of the bomb, the physical body is completely broken, shattered. The mind body and the life force are not. And the person may not even realize that his body has been destroyed. So it used to happen during the Second World War that many of the soldiers, they would be on the battlefield with their gun, and a bomb would explode. There would be a briefly shock, a blanking out for a moment from the bomb. And then they would continue to run around trying to hide or to escape or to attack the enemy, not realizing that their physical body had been completely destroyed. They were still in a consciousness that was dense enough, material enough, that they were seeing things of the material world. But then they would get disoriented because now suddenly they find that they are unable to interact with material objects, or they listen, they hear people, but what they speak is not heard by them. And after a while they notice that they can actually walk through walls and something has changed. And they would be in a state of great confusion. And it was the work of many of what they call helpers, angelic beings, sometimes human beings, to go and convince them that, look, you have died. And the man says, no, I have not died, I am fine. But you don't have a body, but I have a body. And so it'll take a while for them to realize that their physical body is gone, but they're living in their vital mental sheath. And only gradually then they would come to acknowledge, to recognize, and then to make the transition. But this is the extent to which we are dependent on the link between the vital and even to that extent the physical eidolon to experience the material world. If suddenly these two were removed, we would still be here, but we would have no contact and experience of the material world. If you think about this, there's something very profound perception. As souls, primarily as conscious divine beings, we have taken on a mind body, vital sheath, and a physical sheath in order to experience the material domain. As long as we have the physical sheath, we can experience the material domain. When the body is shed, we cannot experience the material domain. We chose to enter the material consciousness and the material experience in order to explore, but also to discover and reveal the secret of matter, the divine hidden in matter, and the infinite potential that is held in the inconscient. But we cannot do this work as explorers of divine beings exploring the material domain if we do not have a physical body. And therefore, evolution had to form a physical body capable enough for the mind body to enter and be conscious as a mind person. And we don't see that in animals, we see that only in the human. And we still have to enter the physical birth and the physical process in order to be able to explore the material domain and fulfill the divine purpose for which we chose this adventure. And that's why the physical body is so important. When we leave the physical body, we are free to wander in the vital or mental worlds and even go into higher domains. But we cannot do this task of exploring materiality and discovering in it the divine principle and awakening in it those divine possibilities. That work needs a physical interface which the body provides. And in between, from the physical interface to the mind consciousness, is the life energy body. And that's why these two layers are so important. Sri Aurobindo writes here, we dwell centered in the mental sheath, and therefore the experience of the material world has to come through the other two sheaths before it can reach us. Now what if in these two sheaths there is a damage? In the body, they'll say the lens of the eye is clouded. I cannot see. The lens has become rigid. I cannot focus. I see blurred. But equally there can be damage in the vital sheath. If in the vital sheath there is damage, then the physical eye may operate perfectly well, and yet I will not be able to see, or my perception will be distorted. There are cases like this, unusual cases which medical science cannot explain. There's a whole category of phenomena classed under post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. So people experienced a certain shock, let's say on the battlefield, a bomb exploded, there was a shock, and then after that the man says, I cannot see anymore. I'm blind. The medical doctors look at the eyes and say, your eyes are perfectly fine. You injured your leg, but your eyes were not affected. Nothing touched your eye. But still the man says, I cannot see. I'm blind, I see only black. And you can observe in the brain response to sight. So you flash a torch in front of the eyes, in the brain there's a response. You flash fingers, 1, 2, 3, in the brain there's a response. So the whole physical machinery signaling all the way to the brain is completely intact. But the person says, I am not able to see. And this is because the damage has taken place in the vital body. And that damage can happen from a material stimulus, but it can also happen from a strong mental reaction. And finally, in the mental body itself, and in the part of the mental body linking to the vital, one can also make changes. I have discussed last time the example of hypnosis. Under hypnosis, you can be taught that one color is another color, the green becomes red and the red becomes green. Or a person, you can be told that this person is now invisible to you. And you will look around, you will not see the person. And if the person stands before a picture, and if your mind has seen the picture before, you will still see the picture, as if the person is not there. If your mind has not seen the picture before, and the person stands in between, and I am asked what is there, I will say, I see a blank wall. There's a complex processing taking place in the mind which fills in the details of what it knows and makes you see it actually. And that's where the mind seeing is taking place. That's where we live, in the primaries, as the primary center of our consciousness. Now all of this can be explained once we understand these layers through which the sense is passing. And so we have, I think, dealt with this sufficiently. We move on with the text now. The first question Sri Aurobindo asked, what is it that is the essence of the thing we call sense? And now he is answering this after observing the phenomenon and the functioning of the sense. What is the essence now? The foundation of sense, therefore, is contact. Physical contact for the physical eidolon, vital contact for the vital imaging, mental contact for the mental imaging. The foundation of sense, therefore, is contact. And the essential contact is the mental, without which there would not be a sense at all. Of all these three, you can have the physical eidolon in the sight, you are not seeing. You can have the vital representation, you are not seeing. It's only when the mind registers that we say, I see. So the soldier, whose physical machinery is intact, since the mind is not registering, he still sees the world as black. He is still blind effectively. Sri Aurobindo gives an example now. The plant, for instance, feels nervously, feels in terms of life energy, precisely as the human nervous system does. And it has precisely the same reactions. But it is only if the plant has rudimentary mind that we can suppose it to be, as we understand the word, sensible of these nervous or vital impressions and reactions. So if the plant does not have mind, we will not say that the plant has a sense. And yet it has the nervous representation of life energy precisely as the human nervous system does, and precisely the same reactions. Now Sri Aurobindo is saying this. Is there any evidence? In the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo takes care to point us in the direction of the evidence when he points to the work of Jagdish Chandra Bose, one of the greatest scientists in modern history, whose work has enormous ramifications for the nature of the true reality, and yet little known because India was at that time under colonial rule, and an Indian scientist doing advanced work was not easily accepted in Europe, which was the center of modern scientific development, but more so because his work was going well beyond the domain of the modern science's premises. Modern science started with assumption that matter is all, matter is the only reality. His work showed that beyond matter there was the domain of life force, which had its own separate reality and its own independent functioning. And he was able to show through his experiments that the responses in plants and the responses in human tissue and the responses in metal, plant and human tissue, all three were exactly the same. Metal fatigue matched with plant fatigue, matched with human muscular fatigue. Exactly the same processes of breakdown and of regeneration. He turned these into graphs, and scientists could not distinguish which was metal, which was plant, which was human tissue. And this tells us something very important. Those experiments, and I don't go further into them, they showed that the response in the plant matched the response in the human being, and even in the metal to that extent. But much more in the domain of response to sensation. The human tissue and the plant tissue matched exactly. There are other experiments subsequently, more recently in the 60s, in particular a series of experiments by somebody by the name of Baxter, who was able to show even plants' response to human consciousness. Approaching the plants with a pair of scissors, the plant showed a strong reaction. He pulled back the scissors, the reaction stopped. Then he said, was it a coincidence? So he approached the scissors close and the plant didn't respond. He took it back, approached close, no response. Then so it must be a fluke. And he again approached to cut and immediately there was a response. So the plant was registering not the movement of the scissors, but the intention to cut. The energy of wanting to cut, not so much the thought, but the energy. Subsequently, he pushed these experiments to such an extent because the plant was now energetically connected to him. He took it up to a range where he would go out of the lab, go through a series of emotional experiences. It was not his thought, it was the emotional content. He would ride a roller coaster, or he would sit next to a water body in still silence, or he would interact with people, go and engage in strong emotional contact, anger and other things, and note down in detail each of these events with the timing. And when he came back, he had the plant being registered on the machine. The reactions in the plant matched exactly time-wise his experiences. Whenever he experienced a strong emotional rush, the plant showed a strong emotional rush. When he was quiet, the plant was quiet. And so this shows through a kind of a empathy an equivalent or equal even response in plant consciousness to the human. And with this background, we can understand what Sri Aurobindo is saying here. The plant, for instance, feels nervously, feels in terms of life energy, precisely as the human nervous system does, and it has precisely the same reactions. But it is only if the plant has rudimentary mind that we can suppose it to be, as we understand the word, sensible of these nervous or vital impressions and reactions. So the question is it sense, does it have a sense of what it is feeling in the vital and nervous level? See, the word vocabulary here fades because we use the same word to describe many different things, sensing. But the mind sensation is different from vital sensation, different from physical sense. And the plant has vital sensation, but until there is a mental registration, we will not say the plant sees or senses or knows the way we know. In the animal, though, it's clear. There is a response in a kind of a rudimentary mental consciousness in the lower animals. In the more sophisticated animals, more sophisticated mental responses. So we say, yes, they have senses. Even that they have sensation of their feelings, and so we can say the animals have feelings. But do plants have feelings? Because there is not a mental registration of their feelings, we do not know, or we say they don't have it. For then it would feel not only nervously but in terms of mind. Sense then may be described as in its essence mental contact with an object and mental reproduction of its image. So now the conclusion we have come to through this deeper understanding of the whole functioning of sense and the essence of sense is this. When there is mental contact, that is essence of senses. Mental contact with an object and mental reproduction of its image. Now remember, the mental reproduction of its image is the part where I say, this is flower on a tree. In the physical level, in the retina, there is no flower and tree distinction. There are only patterns of light and color. In the vital consciousness, there is not flower idea or tree idea. There is only comfort, discomfort, or a certain emotional, energetic reaction. It is mind which says flower on a tree. That's the world in which we are living. The world of ideas, of object. And the mental representation of the image is the seeing of flower as flower, not just as a pattern of color. Now comes a very interesting discussion where Sri Aurobindo puts this whole experience in relation to the current organization of our three koshas and suggests to us a different way in which the whole thing could have been experienced. So he says, all these things we observe and reason of in terms of this embodiment of mind in matter. For these sheaths or koshas are formations in a more and more subtle substance, reposing on gross matter as their base. So you notice, there's a series of translations, the subtlest of which is the mental consciousness, the densest of which is the physical. And there's a whole continuity of passage. Forget the distinctions of three koshas. Look at it rather as a continuity of gradations of consciousness. Something happens at the most material level and it ripples upwards all the way to the subtlest gradation, subtlest substance in the mind. But the whole chain is resting on something which is gross matter as base. So all these things, the world, we observe and reason of in terms of this embodiment of mind in matter. Because of the mind embodied in matter, in the biology it is fixed. It looks at through these gradations all the way down to the material. There's this connection, there's a continuity, and that's how we experience our world. But the whole thing rests on materiality. Our mind itself is embedded in the life force and in the body to such a degree that it cannot see directly beyond. It operates only through the physical linkages. In the text that we are reading, in the synthesis of yoga on Friday, you will remember just 2 days ago we discussed Sri Aurobindo describing how the mind can separate itself from the body and even stand back from it until it feels the body itself to be only a partial expression of mind and life energy. It feels the body as something detachable. But this is possible because the mind's reality of the material world is practically nil except through the translations of these senses and through the life energy. And therefore to it, the body and the reality of the material world is almost fickle. As fickle or as thin as an idea or a mental construct. Of course, when the pain hits you, then you're reminded there's a shock. But even that is a sensation in the life energy much more than in the mind. The mind gives an idea to the pain. This is hurting, this is uncomfortable. But the physical reality of it, we rarely interact with directly. That physical reality is rigid, locked into the laws of the material world, built on inertia, resistance, denseness, insensibility. And therefore, to the extent that the mind is bound to this narrow passage of contact with the material world through the machinery of our consciousness, the mind itself gets pulled in and dulled. The mind feels as if its ideas have the same fixity as the material objects. When the mind disengages from the body, it discovers that its ideas are much more free, much more fluid, much more flexible. It can create realities of its own, which are completely different from the material world. And so we create fictions, we create imaginations, science fiction, where we can create worlds of a totally different kind. But the mind embedded in the physical consciousness cannot do that. For it, imagination is something unreal. It is like a fantasy. Whereas the mind which has disengaged from the biology, for it the world of its imagination is rich, more real than the material world. And now we can understand why. Consider now if the situation was completely reversed. If the base was the mental consciousness and not the material body. And this is the scenario Sri Aurobindo describes now. He says, let us imagine that there is a mental world in which mind and not matter is the base. There, sense would be quite a different thing in its operation. It would feel mentally an image in mind and throw it out into form in more and more gross substance. And whatever physical formations there might already be in that world would respond rapidly to the mind and obey its modifying suggestions. Mind would be masterful, creative, originative, not as with us, either obedient to matter and merely reproductive, or else in struggle with it and only with difficulty able to modify a material predetermined and dully reluctant to its touch. So this is a very different scenario where consider the base of the whole experience. Remember, there are gradations of consciousness from mind all the way to matter, and there's a continuity. Right now matter is the base and so mind is dependent. If we reverse the situation and mind is the base and matter is expression of mind, what would happen? He says, sense would be a different thing in its operation. It would feel mentally an image in mind and throw it out into form in more and more gross substance. So first mind would perceive directly the things of the mind. So mind has flower as an idea, tree as an idea, and an image of flower and an image of tree. Now in your free mind, try to visualize a beautiful rose. Really beautiful rose with all the glow and perfection of its beauty. Almost ethereal, almost divine in its glow. You see, already you're used to the rose as seen through the material sight. And it takes a while to push the image that the mind constructs into its ethereality. Make it as beautiful, impossibly beautiful as you can conceive of it. Perhaps images of the movie Avatar, if you've seen those, and the plants giving off light and sceneries of strange types. But something made absolutely glowing, translucent in its beauty, where it emits light from within, and a light which is its perfume, which is its joy, glowing out. This is possible for the mind to conceive. This is how mind would see its ideas in their ideal character. And then when it sees, and you see the mind seeing is instant, it is almost in identity with what it sees. And from there, because remember that would be the base in such a world, the form would ripple through all the denser gradations which would respond to its will. And so mind would throw it out into form in more and more gross substance. Now you see, mind's ideation of the form is still in the domain of idea quality, idea form. The moment you start giving to it specifics of detail, you see your rose is still glowing. Now you give to it specifics of detail, the smoothness of the surface, the texture of the surface. As you start filling, you are materializing and densifying the idea of rose. And it would ripple through all these gradations all the way to matter until it became, in matter, a plastic expression of the rose. Throw it out into form in more and more gross substance, and whatever physical formations there might already be in that world would respond rapidly to the mind and obey its modifying suggestions. So if matter was then expressive of the mind's consciousness, I could take a stone and shape it like clay just by visualizing it, imagining it, molding it with my mind. Already, if you take a lump of clay, you have to push against the resistance of the clay. You put water to soften it. But then it is too soft and it can break. So, you have to play in between, not too soft, not too hard, shaping it, and then it has to become dry in order to be firm. But in this world, mind could simply look at the stone and shape it and carve out of it whatever form it wanted, and leave it hard if it willed it to be hard, or leave it plastic and soft if it willed it to be soft. But the hardness would be its free choice. So it could take a hard stone, shape it, and still leave it hard. Now this whole experience is in fact the reality of the mental world when we enter the mental world. But the mental substance does not have the rigidity and density of the material substance and the objectivity of the material substance. And therefore, for the mind to be fulfilled in its creativity, it must go all the way into material expression, and then we say, yes, now I have made it permanent. Matter is the domain of permanence of form. Form exists on other gradations, but as a secondary quality. Thought expressed as form, but the thought is primary. Idea is first in the mental world. In the vital world, energy expressed as form, but energy is primary, form of energy is secondary. That's why things seen in the aura have a certain fluidity, are sensed, and the image forms later. It feels like there's some kind of a dullness or grayness in your atmosphere. The picture of grey follows, the density and the dullness quality of it is first sensed energetically. The mind then gives to it an associated image, form, color. And I sense a grayness, a dullness in this part. Do you have an illness in the stomach? That's how the clairvoyant sight works. But the material world is form first. Energy of form second. Idea of form third. So in the relationships across these three worlds, right now mind is dependent on matter and so limited in its freedom of expression. But if this relationship was reversed and matter could freely express what mind conceives, then what happens? He says, mind would be masterful, creative, originative. First of all, it will have complete mastery. And whatever it creates, it would be able to express fully. It would originate all forms. Now, why is Sri Aurobindo describing all this? Because in fact, this is the truth on a certain level. Before the material world was created, before things can appear in the material world or evolve through evolution or through some process, those things are already existent in the mental world. From the mental world, the idea of the material world was formed, originally from the supramental world, but through the mental world, the form was given. But as matter became more and more dense, it lost the flexibility of the mental domain. And yet the ideas imprinted in the material substance continue to push secretly from inside the rigidity of form. All the creatures which have evolved, were already existent in the material, in the mental worlds. But the physical form, because it has evolved in the resistance of matter, is dull, has inertia, has incapacity. Whereas in the mental world, the same creatures are free, flowing, bright, almost immortal, perfect. And so the physical world is a dulled representation. But this relationship can and will eventually re-establish when the supramental consciousness takes up the mind as its instrument, can take up the substance of life force and matter itself as its instrument, and form and articulate freely from its freedom the material substance. In the supramental consciousness, in the body which is supramentalized, the form of the body would be expressive of the inhabiting consciousness. To the extent that the consciousness was developed, it could even take external material like the stone and shape it by imposing its will. But the capacity would depend and would be symbolic of the evolution even of the supramental being. But within the supramental body itself, that kind of fluidity of material substance will be natural. So in such a situation, mind would be masterful, creative and originative, and not as with us. And he describes now three things. What is our current condition of the relationship of mind with matter? Either obedient to matter and merely reproductive, or else in struggle with it and only with difficulty able to modify a material. So the first is obedient. What the body decides, what matter decides, what the material world is reflected in my mind. My mind gets dulled, ideas get fixed, and my mind is unable to be plastic. It accepts the imposition of matter. Or, slightly better, is when merely reproductive. It copies, it imitates, and so the art of the barbarian is simply to copy things, to represent them for practical purpose. Okay, I saw this, here's what I saw. Sri Aurobindo explains how the true purpose of art is not simply to make a replica, otherwise the camera would be the perfect artist. The true purpose of art is to reveal what is not visible to the physical sight, but which is the reality of the thing. And when you reveal that, that's when the art becomes fulfilling, because it reveals a deeper spiritual truth behind, of which this material form is the dull representation. And when the spiritual truth is revealed in the art, we look at the thing and we say, here is something beautiful. And because it represents something which is spiritual behind the form, and the character of the spirit is immortality, eternity, infinity, unity. Therefore, in this picture, which is a great work of art, there is a vibration which is a vibration of immortality. That is why the great masters, having created something 300 years ago, we still look at the image and say, oh, how wonderful, because it is still living, it is still permanent and still fresh and new. Whereas a simple picture, maybe richly detailed, of a scenery which reveals nothing special, we will say, oh, this is a scenery from the 1800s. Okay, it has historical value, but it does not give me that experience of something beautiful, something great, something new, something which changes me from looking at this. Whereas the master, his painting or his sculpture, each time I look at it, although I've seen it before many times, it still reveals something new to me. It's living, it is alive, it communicates, and it teaches me even something. And so, the mere reproduction of material world is what we see in a mind which has been dulled by matter. But as mind begins to separate itself from the material limitations of the consciousness, it finds that it has a greater freedom, but its freedom is constrained by the material, and so comes the third. In struggle with matter, mind is now neither obedient nor merely reproductive, but in struggle with it. Because there's something greater which I have to express, and matter does not allow me to express it. And only with difficulty able to modify a material predetermined and dully reluctant to its touch. So matter has its own predetermination. It will do only what is bound to its habit of, or its law of matter. And if at all I put pressure, it reluctantly responds with resistance and also dully. All the finer details are lost. So try, for example, your beautiful rose which you have visualized, try to create it now in clay. And you'll see not only you have to push against the clay, but after all the best you can do, it is only dulled. What we have seen today is something quite new, which we do not see in the history of the last many thousand years. On the computer screen, you have a representation of the realities of the mental world represented in matter in a way that is fluid and flexible. The image itself, first of all, is able to give out colors which do not belong properly to the material world. And Mother speaks of this in one of her talks. She says that the subtle worlds have colors which are far richer, brighter, translucent, glowing, which cannot be represented physically with the current paints and colors that we have. But then she says, a way will be found to represent them in the future. And we have not been able to do it in paints yet. Some paints we are able to bring some kind of a glow. But on the computer screen we are able to do this. But the computer screen does not have the permanence of material form. It is still taking place in matter, but it is matter which has been pushed to a certain limit, where it has been freed from the dullness of its form. It is allowed to represent as an image which is fluid and flowing. The screen itself never changes. The screen itself does not become the object, but it represents it in a certain fluid way. And so we are able to transcribe realities of the mental or subtle worlds generally into this material substance, and even make three-dimensional objects which are fluid, flowing, as our mind wills it to flow. Interesting, isn't it? What he has described here, mind, it would feel mentally an image in mind and throw it out into form in more and more gross substance. And whatever physical formations there might already be in that world would respond rapidly to the mind and obey its modifying suggestions. Mind would be masterful, creative, originative. This we are able to experience today with the computer screen and with the cutting edge of three-dimensional viewing through virtual reality. We are able to see it in 3 dimensions wearing these special goggles, and with our hands we can shape the substance. Of course, there's never a physical substance there. You are moving your hands in the air, the computer detects your fingers, it makes the object take a form, and so on. Even with tactile feedback, you may feel the pressure of touching an object which is not there, and feel as if you're experiencing in the material world the realities which are proper to the mental world. And so we have found means by which the realities of the mental world can be brought into our material experience and the material senses. But still remember, what you're experiencing is in the mental world and of the mental world. With the supramental consciousness, though, these limitations of these domains will be overcome, and the supermind will allow us to do this directly by direct action of consciousness in mind, in the vital, and even in the physical consciousness. When the physical consciousness is awakened to its own higher possibilities, we will sense in matter equally as we sense in life force, equally as we sense in mind, though differently sensed. And all of these belong to part of our future evolution. So this being the case of such a experience, Sri Aurobindo says, it would be, mind would be in such a domain, it would be subject to whatever supramental power might be above it, master of a ductile and easily responsive material. Subject to the supramental power working through it, it would be master of a material which would be responsive and ductile, plastic, shaping instantly to its will. But still, sense would be there, sense with a capital S now, unlike the physical senses. There's a higher sense now. Sense would be there because contact in mental consciousness and formation of images would still be part of the law of being. So mind would still see, mind would make contact, mind would form, even in such a world where the whole relationship is reversed from matter to mind. So with this, logically, Sri Aurobindo has shown us through this analysis that essentially all senses are contact of mind with things, even if material things. And even if materiality was an expression of mind, still sense would be there, and sense is fundamentally contact of mind with things. Mind, in fact, or active consciousness generally, has four necessary functions which are indispensable to it, wherever and however it may act, and of which the Upanishads speak in four terms: Vijnana, Prajnana, Samjnana, and Ajnana. And now Sri Aurobindo gets into a detailed description of how mind operates, how at all it reaches out, grasps an object of sense, draws it into it, and then has the experience of sensing and identification and mastering and willing it. This whole process is natural in a supramental consciousness, but mind replicates it in a certain way, and the whole psychology of its working is described in great detail, which we will only take up in our next session, which will be after a month. We continue this text on the 5th of June, but from 3rd June onwards, the Friday class also will begin. In between, we will continue to show the videos of the earlier recordings and some others for those who are interested. But here we pause and look now at the continuity of the big picture Sri Aurobindo has presented. He has given us an insight into the true nature of what we call the senses. And although there are 5 senses, behind the 5, it is always the mind making contact in its consciousness with something of the material world or of the mental world even. And after this discussion of how internally mind reaches out, draws in, grasps and masters, the next chapter will deal with the relationship of mind with the 5 senses, and we will get a complete picture of what is meant by sense of our sense. What is that greater sight or hearing or generally sense which is behind the mind, by which the mind is able to sense, see, hear and experience? And in what way is that to be awakened? In what way will that see and hear and fulfill the limitations of the mind's senses? So this is the further exploration which we will continue afterwards. It's a fascinating text, and you see here all the basic principles of artificial intelligence and robotics are held here and even described in great detail. In a sense, all of modern attempts to replicate the human senses and the intelligence actually follow all this knowledge, but in a very rudimentary way. If this knowledge could be consciously brought in and these functions organized, we would be able to replicate or speed up the whole evolution of modern artificial intelligence and robotics, and perhaps could get to a point where even we will be able to make robots or computers which are expressive of intelligence of a much higher grade. It is even possible, and such things have been done, to create a being, whether made of tissue or of metal and silicon, which is able to express mental consciousness. And therefore we would say, yes, it has senses. It has even thought. And one could find degrees, gradations of the senses and of thought that such creature could have. And we could even make a creature which has practically none of it, none of mind and thought, which would be then dully conscious, but still able to function. And we would then call it a robot. And we would not mind if such a creature would be treated like a slave, or would be broken or dismantled, because it would not be killing a life form which is self-aware. But these are all questions which bring us into domain of ethics, which humanity is still exploring. For those of you who are interested, you may want to consider seeing a movie where this question has been explored somewhat in the story form, which is called Ex Machina, where a robot is made to become almost conscious as a human being, self-aware, and then there's a struggle of whether such a robot should be or can be dismantled. Would it not be killing of an intelligence? Or whether it should be allowed to grow even if the intelligence is not sufficiently developed. And so there's a whole discussion around that. And it's a fascinating movie for what it suggests. And all of these things are possible potentially. You can meditate briefly.